We're going to get started. Welcome to Market News International's March webinar, American Fiscal Policy at the Crossroads, presented by John Shaw. In hand, I'm the marketing manager here at M&I. And today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Market News International. Then John Shaw will get on to the meat of the presentation. And then we'll accept questions and answers at the end. You can enter questions that you have in the chat box. You can address them either myself, to John, or to all panelists at any time during the presentation. You can also email John with questions after the webinar, and you can email me for a recording of this webinar or the slides used. With emails and contact information available at the end of the presentation. So, Market National, most of you are familiar with us. We're a subsidiary of the Deutsche Börse Group and the leading provider of news and analysis specifically for the global FX and fixed income markets. We are one of 4 real-time English language financial news agencies with credentials recognized by governments and central banks of all major economies. We offer exclusive monetary and fiscal policy reports, economic indicators and forecasts, and marketing interviews with key central bank and finance ministry officials, government policymakers, and economists. Our guests are located in 12 news bureaus across Europe, America, and Asia. We have 60 full-time reporters, many of which are former fixed income and currency traders and strategists who know the markets and combine their economics expertise with meticulous financial journalism. The featured reporter is John Shaw. He has covered Capitol Hill for M&I for over 20 years as Congressional Correspondent. He came to M&I in 1991 and since then has been reporting on fiscal policy, trade, pensions, banking, China relations, and many other issues. During today's webinar, will put U.S. current fiscal challenges into a historical context and assess the possibility that President Obama and Congress will confront the country's growing fiscal problems before they become a full-scale crisis. At that, I will turn the presentation over to John.
And thank everyone for joining me for this talk about American fiscal policy. And what I'd like to do over the next 20 or 30 minutes is just outline some of the central fiscal challenges the U.S. faces, talk about the particular issues that are on the plate of Congress right now, to walk through some of the key congressional leaders who are going to be addressing these challenges, and then I guess most difficult thing to kind of give my assessment of where all of this is heading. I'm beginning with just a brief story, which is interesting and true. A couple of months ago, actually about 2 months ago, I was in the Capitol and I bumped into Leon Panetta. I've been covering Panetta since 1991. He was then the chairman of the House Budget Committee. He then went on to become President Clinton's budget director and then chief of staff, followed him through the budget fights of the 90s. He then left and created a think tank in California, kept in touch with him, interviewed him a fair amount, and then he with the election of President Obama, became the CIA director, a very, very different calling in life. So I ended up bumping him into the hall, and we chatted for a few minutes, and he asked if I was still covering the budget and all. And so he was leaving. I said, rejoin the budget fight. We really could use you. And he laughed and said, it's easier to fight Al-Qaeda. And I think that gallows humor might give a little sense of just how serious the country's fiscal problems are. And what I'd like to do is just briefly outline just the scope of the problems that the country is facing. And I think maybe one way to do it is to just do a snapshot of a year. And in the slide in front of us, we have the fiscal year 2011 budget, the current budget year. And it's just striking to just look at the big numbers. I mean, here revenues are $3.8 trillion. Revenues are $2.1 trillion with a deficit of $1.6 trillion. It's almost a definition of a dysfunctional government in which revenues and outlays have no relationship to each other. And if you look a little bit further down in my presentation, the Congressional Budget Office has done a report in January on 10-year deficits using very, very optimistic numbers, up with cumulative deficits of almost $7 trillion. The report also showed that the debt held by the public has jumped from about 36% of GDP in 2000 to 59%. Now it's slated to grow well into the 60s by the middle part of this decade. The CBO also showed that current trends, revenues are going to be about 24% of GDP just in about a decade. So that gives you one sense of just the scope of the problems. And it's interesting, in the course of this past year, the Senate Budget Committee has held some really interesting hearings on just what the country's fiscal situation is. And Chairman Ken Conrad, at every hearing, makes this following point. He says, spending right now as a percentage of GDP is at a 60-year high, and revenues as a percentage of GDP is at a 60-year low. So that's, again, almost the definition of a government whose budget is not functional. And going forward, the situation is only going to worsen. We've all heard about the 7 million baby boomers who are going to retire, and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. Healthcare costs continue to rise well above inflation, putting pressure on the government budget. There's been all sorts of worried comments from people like David Walker, who thinks that a debt crisis of the European scale could hit the U.S. within several years. Alan Greenspan has also said things along this line. So now maybe to shift to just the current issues that are on the table. And it's those of you who are following the budget, I mean, the one thing that's most striking is that Congress is right in the midst of about a 6-month battle over the fiscal year 2011 budget. Now, FY11 started October 1 of 2010 and extends until September 30th of 2011. And we've been involved in really a bruising, bitter battle for almost 6 months since Republicans won control of the House in November about trying to finish the budget for a fiscal year that began last October. There have been 6 temporary spending bills that have been passed to keep the government going. When I did this slide, it seemed like the two sides were about $30 billion apart, but now it seems like they're much closer, just only a few $1 billion, and yet both sides continue to just pound away at each other and confront a real possibility of a government shutdown next week. I think the general view is that over the next 2 weeks, the situation is going to be resolved one way or the other. The two parties are not that far apart in terms of the overall numbers. There's some policy riders that are also going to have to be resolved. But to me, the central point to draw from the battle over the 2011 budget is that it has been such a long, bruising, contentious fight over a lot of stakes. Only, they've been fighting mostly on like about 12% of the federal budget, the non-defense discretionary. And I talk to budget experts. The one point that they make to me over and over again is this has been a really, really difficult battle over very, very little. And there's a sense that maybe the energies of Congress and the White House would have been much better spent focusing on the FY12 budget, which have the slide in front of you. That budget year really kind of began in January, when the President gave his State of the Union address. In February, he presented his budget. I think by all accounts, the Obama budget was a tactical, careful budget. I think almost everyone, Democrats and Republicans, thought he would be a little more aggressive, would at least find a couple areas in the entitlements in particular that he would propose reforms. He chose not to, and is largely seen as kind of playing a rope-a-dope and waiting for Congress for its budgets. House Republican budget is likely to come out next week, largely drafted by Paul Ryan, who's the chairman of the House Budget Committee. Everyone's looking closely at this budget to see what it is that the Republicans envision for fiscal policy going forward. There's the expectation there's going to be some pretty sweeping changes in entitlement programs, but those are not going to be that will not include specific legislative language. It's going to be more conceptual. Budget resolutions just set out broad spending and revenue goals, but it'll be interesting to see how the House Republicans go forward on entitlements. They've vowed that they will, unlike the president, make a serious run at reforming entitlements. I think the second part of the package is also going to be what they do on revenues. Ryan and many House Republicans have been strong supporters of extending the Bush-era tax cuts. The budget analysts have noted that the cost of extending those tax cuts is about $4 trillion over a decade. So by just extending the Bush tax cuts, you effectively consume all of the massive spendings, about $4 trillion that Bowles-Simpson Commission generated last year. So Ryan will go first next week. I think a lot of people are very intrigued about where Kent Conrad, who's the Senate Budget Committee Chairman, a Democrat. Conrad is a deficit hawk. He's retiring. He's made it clear that he wants to swing for the fences and do some big things on the budget. He's also trying to bring some Republicans in, and he's trying to see if he can cobble together a bipartisan deficit reduction plan with some Republican support, based a lot on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which he sat on and voted for. So the two issues, the FY11 and FY12 budget, they're in play. They sort of are unfolding almost concurrently. And then this issue that's on the table is the debt limit. It seems likely that there's going to be a need to increase the $14.3 trillion debt ceiling sometime between the middle of April and the end of May. Everyone agrees that this is not going to be a clean debt limit hike. There's going to be some provisions put on it. There is talk about the Conrad people the group that Conrad is working with, trying to put together some sort of deficit reduction plan, even some kind of budget process on the debt limit to make it easier for people to vote for it. It's very unclear what that would look like, whether it would be long-term goals on revenues or outlays, if it'll be some kind of process to try to bring the deficits down. So there's going to be, I think there's going to be a movement by some of the moderates to attach some kind of process reform. And the Senate Republican leadership has said that tomorrow they're going to outline a balanced budget constitutional amendment that they want to have voted on as the Congress considers the debt ceiling legislation. It's unclear if they would actually try to attach the constitutional amendment to the debt hike. I don't think that would even work logistically, but they want to have it voted on as a debt limit is considered. The version that they've been floating of the balanced budget amendment seems extraordinarily ambitious and candidly unworkable. They're envisioning on capping spending at 18% of GDP. I don't think anyone believes that that's remotely possible, but it seems to be their starting offer as to what a balanced budget amendment would look like. And then the final issue I want to talk about, just in terms of what is on play now, is tax reform. We've heard a lot about it. President Obama endorsed it conceptually in the State of the Union address. Republican leaders endorse it conceptually, Democratic leaders. But of course, when you get into the details, that's when the agreement breaks down. The Senate Finance Committee is holding hearings on it. The House Ways and Means Committee is holding hearings on it. And the one issue that is, I think, most interesting is whether there will be an effort to try to do a broad, comprehensive tax reform, or they'll just try to break out corporate tax reform and get that on in the next year or two. And Geithner, in his testimonies in Congress, has made it very clear and has said repeatedly that he would like a real effort to do corporate tax reform in this Congress. So that's something that I think will be in play as the months unfold. I might want to talk just for a few minutes about some of the key players who are involved in this effort to put together a better fiscal policy. On the Republican side, the two leaders, the Speaker John Boehner and the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, are typical conservative Republicans who focus a lot on cutting spending. They're also in support of tax cuts. They've been bolder candidly than have the Democratic leaders in calling for entitlement reform. They haven't really embraced any specifics, but Boehner in particular has said that the Republican budget should include entitlement reform. And as mentioned earlier, Paul Ryan, the chairman of the House Budget Committee, will be launching the effort. Dave Kemp is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the Tax Writing Committee, and he's putting together the hearings on tax reform, and he'll be an interesting player to watch. To mention, at least briefly, the Tea Party. I guess I have to admit that up to this point, I had been somewhat inclined to think that their strength has been overstated. My sense is, as a political movement, they're unlikely to be particularly strong in the future, but they are a real force in this Congress. There's no doubt about it that they're putting a lot of pressure on Boehner, particularly on this current budget debate, not to make concessions. And they really are putting heat on the Republican leadership, and I think they're going to be part of this debate. They tend to support spending cuts. They tend to be quite vague about where they want those spending cuts to come from, and but still are an important force. On the Democratic side, you have Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker, now the House Minority Leader, who I think you could call fairly conventional Democrats. Both are very protective of Social Security. Both of them are adamant about not reforming it. But have been very, very cautious on entitlement reform. And I think maybe the most interesting person is Dick Durbin, who is the number 2 Senate Democrat. He's a majority whip. He was a member of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, supported the plan, much to the surprise of many Democrats, and I think even some members of his family. But I think Durbin has said that the fiscal situation is so serious that that some bold leadership is required, and he might be a bit of a wild card. And also, as I mentioned, there is some bipartisan talks going underway. This group has been dubbed the Gang of Six. They've had some meetings in which they've had 30 or so senators talking about seeing if some way to put together a broad group to cut the deficit. So that's the central leaders who I think are going to be involved in this. And I guess I'd like to move a little bit towards what I think is likely to happen. And this, of course, is very, very hard to predict. One thing that strikes me is a bit of a historical parallel to the Gingrich era. And you have to be careful not to get get entrapped by historical analogies. Oftentimes they confuse more than they clarify. But as I look back on the Gingrich era, I was struck by the first year that they took power in 1995. They had a brutal year of fighting with the Clinton administration. There were a couple government shutdowns. There was a big battle over the debt ceiling. The next year, 1996, an election year, both sides decided that they needed to get some accomplishments. The rhetoric cooled. There was a real effort to start finding some areas of compromise. And then in 1997, after Clinton was reelected, there was a successful effort by Congress and the Clinton administration to pass a balanced budget agreement. I'd add at that point the economy was growing so strong that it made the deficit reduction effort pretty easy to do. In fact, the joke during those budget hearings was they needed to hurry up and get an agreement or the economy would balance the budget for them. And I think as we look at where we're at now, I think 2011 is likely to be an extremely contentious year. I've assumed there would not be a government shutdown just because I think that it wouldn't serve either party, but there's certainly going to be some brinksmanship in the coming weeks and months. I think there's more of a chance of some areas of compromise in 2012, and I think 2013 could be a year in which either a reelected President Obama or a Republican president really tried to move forward on getting together an agreement. There's just that, and I'll just kind of shift to my conclusion of where things stand by knowing that both a fair amount of bad news and some good news. Bad news is, I guess, obvious. Our bid has become an extraordinarily complicated problem that requires a fundamental overhaul of spend and tax programs. Just the opening snapshot showing just how great the disparity is between what we spend and what we bring in. It cries out for a fundamental overhaul of the budget. But that is not made easier by the fact that I think the American public has been pretty incoherent on fiscal policy. They're all for spending cuts in the abstract, always dislike tax increases, but are putting specific options on the table. They tend not to be particularly consistent. I think, no one supports, or very few support, or I've seen recent polls in which very few have supported entitlement reform, even fairly modest restructurings of Social Security and Medicare. So you have a public that is not really pushing very hard on the deficit front, despite the push that the Tea Party, I have to acknowledge that group is hard on deficit, again, but more in a general way. And then finally, the final piece of the bad news is just how deeply polarized the political system is, how little trust there is between the parties, and just how locked in they are, and how little movement there seems to be towards a budget agreement. But on the positive side, I see a few things. And the first is I think there's a growing sense that a day of reckoning is approaching, that the country's fiscal problems are very serious. They may not quite be at the scale of Greece, but there's a sense that the country is moving relentlessly towards a cliff, and something needs to be done. The other thing that I would say is positive is that there's a lot of specific ideas that are on the table. I've mentioned the Simpson-Bowles Commission a few times. They put together a package of about $4 trillion in 10-year budget savings. The Rivlin-Domenici Commission, meeting at almost the same time, didn't get quite as much press, together a package of about $6 trillion in savings, calling for fundamental overhaul of the tax code. The Congressional Budget Office has each year puts out a book of budget options, and that's attracting much more attention. These are options in which you can cut spending and taxes. And one little popular culture thing that I took note of a couple months ago is Esquire magazine convened a working group of former senators and had them holed up in a New York hotel for a few days, asking them to put together a budget plan, and actually put together a package that would reduce the deficit sharply over a number of years. So I think the final point, and I might even end with another thing that I remember from covering Panetta when he was chairman of the House Budget Committee chairman, because the one point he used to make relentlessly, and oftentimes this was criticizing the first President Bush, he said, in terms of actually moving aggressively on cutting the deficit, you need either strong presidential leadership or an economic crisis. And I think we're pretty close to that point now. And I think there's a general agreement that so far Obama has been very cautious, very tactical on the budget. His focus has been trying to get the economy going, trying to create jobs. I think his short-term political fate, no doubt, is more closely linked to getting the economy growing and jobs created. But I think his long-term legacy is going to hinge on just how he has tackled this budget crisis. I think there's general agreement the last decade was totally squandered in American fiscal policy. And this coming decade, the United States has to do a lot better, or the quality of life is going to decline substantially. So let's end with that, with those less than uplifting words. But there is a sense that I think that in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see some significant movement towards confronting the deficit, or I think we're going to see a major economic crisis, which might cause lawmakers in the White House to reach to a major crisis and still to put together some sort of deficit reduction package. For that, I would thank you for listening and would be glad to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We did receive one question, and that is, do you think the long, contentious fight over the 2011 budget has complicated efforts to reach a longer-term, more comprehensive budget agreement?
I do think so. In fact, there was an interesting hearing just a few weeks ago in which Pete Domenici, the former chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, was testifying. And it was an interesting moment because he was testifying on long-term fiscal issues, and a freshman Republican senator from Wisconsin, Senator Johnson, said to Domenici, I mean, don't you think that it's been really good that we're fighting this fight in 2011 and we're really kind of going at it right away and we're not waiting? And he phrased the question in such a way that he expected Domenici to agree, and Domenici said, well, I have to give you an answer you don't want to hear. No, I think this fight has been an application of time and energy. I think it would have been much better served trying to build consensus for 5 or 10-year deficit reduction plan rather than having a 6-month battle or a fairly narrow slice of the budget. I should also add editorially that I think it should be noted that the reason they're having this fight over the 2011 budget is because the Democrats did not pass any of their spending bills last Congress when they were in control. So we'll answer your question more specifically. I think this current fight has been more of a distraction than it's been help in trying to get the deficit under control.
Okay, another question is, what is your feeling about the likelihood of a shutdown? What are the risks to each party if it does happen?
I think if you would have asked me this a week ago, I would have said very, very low. Asking me today, I would say a little higher. I was at a briefing with the House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, who up until now has said, there will be no shutdown. It would be in no one's interest. At his press conference yesterday, he was hedging much more, saying if there is a shutdown, it's the fault of Democrats. He was talking about we would find ways to fund emergency services, and so on. So that part of it is just the brinksmanship. I mean, this next week will be full of brinksmanship and a lot of threats about a government shutdown. I don't think it really serves either party's interest. I think the Republicans who want to advance a much bolder budget later in the year would be more better served. If you're going to risk a government shutdown, do it over some big stakes and a sweeping deficit reduction plan rather than a fairly narrow sliver of the budget. But again, I think the Tea Party element is critical here. I think the House Republican leadership is under very intense pressure not to make any concessions on the FY11 budget.
Okay, and we'll have this last question, and then we'll wrap up. There's been a lot of talk about another Homeland Investment Act like that passed in 2004 to allow U.S. corporates to repatriate earnings at a reduced rate. What do you think the odds are of an HA2 passing?
I think they're quite low. I know there's a lot of effort on the business community to get interest in that, but there are a handful of lawmakers who are interested. I mentioned Eric Cantor, the House Majority Leader. He was in California last week at Stanford and made a pitch for a so-called tax holiday. He's made that before. He spoke again yesterday at a briefing. Orrin Hatch, the top Republican on the Finance Committee. So there's a little bit of agitation in Congress, but it's muted. There was, as people know, an attempt to do this in 2004, 2005. The general view from Congress is that money that was repatriated was not used for job creation, and there's a sense that they were on some level taken to the cleaners, and it would be ill-advised to do it again. The Secretary has spoken pretty clearly on this. I think some have kind of twisted his words, but he was pretty clear about saying he did not want to do it. He would reluctantly consider doing it as part of a broader corporate tax reform, but his clear focus was he didn't think this was a good way to construct tax policy. So to summarize, I think there's going to be some agitation. Candidly, I think some are pressing for it as a way to favor with the business community and maybe get some campaign contributions going. I think there's a relatively low prospect that would pass this year.
Okay, John, thanks a lot. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Lauren.
Okay, and next webinar in April will be Wednesday, April 13th, and the topic will be the Eurozone in Portugal, given by Nick Shamim. When your webinar session today, you'll immediately be directed to the registration page, or you can always register later by visiting marketnews.webex.com. And here's our contact information. You can contact John for any questions you have about today's presentation. You can email me for a recording of today's webinar or a copy of the slides used in today's presentation. And you have sales contact number as well. And also contacts on Twitter and Facebook. So much for joining today. Bye-bye.